Good morning, everyone. My name is Mona Eltahawy. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I begin, as I begin everything, with what I call my declaration of faith: fuck the patriarchy.
Fuck the patriarchy.
And if you're not awake, I hope you're awake now. So I'm delighted to be moderating this panel as both a feminist author and a member of the board of advisors for the Institute for Journalism and Social Change, co-founded by my feminist sister comrade right here, Nana. So because we have such a tight schedule, I'm going to go straight to questions because we want to have some questions from you at the end of our panel. So please start thinking of things that you want to ask this excellent group of speakers. So Nana, hello.
Hey Mona, always good to be in conversation with you.
We always have fun on our panels, so let's have more fun today. Feminist fun. So Nana, what makes, actually, I want to say a few things before I begin to ask my question, because I feel this is a good background. So when Nana wrote to me and asked me if I would become a member of the board of advisors of IGSC, I was delighted for a reason that my younger self wished she had had this organization. Because when I was 27, so almost exactly 30 years ago, I went to the United Nations Women's Conference in Beijing, China. And it was feminist paradise. I was 27 years old. I was a correspondent for Reuters news agency. And I took a month off so I could go and tour around China by myself and then go and cover the women's conference, which back then used to happen every 10 years. And I was able to go there because an Indian author and editor had put together a feminist newspaper, and she flew in journalists from different parts of the world. So there was a journalist who came from Latin America. I went in from Southwest Asia, the Middle East, North Africa. Others came from other parts of the Americas and the rest of the world, so that each of us could cover our region at the conference. And like I said, it was feminist paradise. I was meeting feminist heroes. They were launching their books. I was hearing from Dalit women from India, sex workers, women who wanted to have women's unpaid labor as part of a country's GDP. It was amazing. But the fact that I had to take a month off from my regular job to go to China to cover this women's conference was exactly at the heart of my dilemma, because I felt like one part of me was a journalist and the other part of me was a feminist, and I wanted to reconcile the two. And so for my reporting with Reuters and then later with other news agents, well, other news outlets, I tried my best to always include stories that had a feminist angle. But most of the time I was doing the news. And what is the news? And who determines what is the news? It's usually by men, for men, and about what men have done. And so this dilemma of how do I reconcile my feminism with my journalism and with my reporting is so beautifully dovetailed in the work that the Institute for Journalism and Social Change does, and especially in the handbook that we're about to publish, called the Handbook for Feminist Investigative Reporting. Is that right? That's the title. So when Nana told me about this, I was like, oh my God, where were you 30 years ago? When many people here did not even exist. But it was so beautiful in that bringing together of feminism and reporting, and this is what I hope that we convey to you today in our discussion for today's session. So having given that background, Nana, thank you for resolving my dilemma and making it possible for younger journalists now. Tell us what makes an investigation feminist and how that goes to the heart of what the IGSC does.
No, thank you so much. And what the IGSC does is it brings together journalists, it brings together activists, it brings together researchers, people across a range of disciplines who are interested in gender justice and creating a world where women thrive, where people from sexual minorities thrive, where people from all sorts of marginalized backgrounds thrive. And for me, what makes an investigation feminist is really the team working on the investigation, the political beliefs of those people, if they are feminists themselves. I don't think you can have someone who is not a feminist actually lead or be part of a feminist investigation. It's also about the way in which the work is designed. So with IGSC, we're very intentional in working with people who represent movements, who are activists, who are themselves active in struggles, who are looking for a better world, and we want to work with them on a basis of equality. So a lot of the investigations we do are actually informed by activists. So the investigation that people probably know us the most for is one which we titled Progressive Crash, for the anti-LGBTI backlash in Uganda, where we found that up to 70 million of overseas development aid had gone to a range of civil society organizations who had been advocating for the Anti-Homosexuality Act in that country, which includes the death penalty, right? And we did that work because Claire Provo, who is my co-founder with IGSC and a feminist investigative journalist, and I had previously done an investigation for CNN where we had found 5 million of overseas development aid had gone to people advocating for what has been described as the worst anti-gay bill in Ghana. You know, and then activists from Uganda saw that and said, well, can you look into what's going on in our country? Because the Anti-Homosexuality Act had come up again. It was clear it was going to be passed, and they wanted to find out who is actually behind this, who is literally providing money to these actors. So for me, that's an example of a feminist investigation, an investigation that has been prompted by the community. We are responding to the needs of the community. We know that if we do the investigation, the community will find it helpful for their advocacy. Yeah.
Thank you, Nana. And I'm so glad you mentioned that the parameters of a feminist investigation are much broader than I think what many people kind of naively think feminism is. Because I think a lot of people think that feminism is anything a woman does, which is just so not true. And I think that a lot of people think the patriarchy is men, which is also not true. So I would like to begin defining things here. And I think it's important to recognize and speak to what feminism is. And my definition of feminism is the destruction of patriarchy. And then if you were to ask me, what is patriarchy, Mona? I would say to you, patriarchy is a system of oppressions that privileges male dominance. So notice I didn't say patriarchy is men or anything that a man does, and feminism isn't women or anything that a woman does, because there are some women who benefit from patriarchy, such as the white women who vote for Donald Trump, such as women who voted for your fascist prime minister in Italy here, Giorgia Meloni. So it's not about men and women, it's about a system of oppressions that privileges male dominance, and feminism wants to destroy the patriarchy, that system of oppressions that privileges male dominance. So Neha, perhaps you'd also like to tackle your own definitions of patriarchy and feminism, while also, because I know that you can do many things at once, while also telling us about what you've learned about what feminist investigative reporting is from the start of your career to now.
Sure. So for me, when thinking about my definition of feminism, of course, I do agree with Mona. I think equality is the basis of that. So fighting, whether it's politically, ideologically, theologically, for equality of the sexes and genders, if we're going to be inclusive in our definition. So I've been working as a freelance reporter based in Nairobi, Kenya for the past almost a decade now. I started getting into feminist investigations a while ago, and since then I've done a number of different kinds of investigations. And one of the things that I found, I think, is you really have to fight to get people to give a shit about feminist investigations, which is really unfortunate. But something that I think as reporters, as feminist reporters, we have an obligation to do. And I'll just give you an example. You know, some investigations really pop, and I think there have been other investigations that are equally important that have fallen flat in terms of the pickup, the readership, how viral they've gone, and how much attention they've caused, or how much impact they've made. So I did an investigation, which I've written about in the handbook, in the Feminist Investigative Handbook, into a chain of schools called Bridge International Academies. Bridge is a for-profit school a chain of schools founded by 2 Harvard graduates that serve low-income kids in countries like Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, and India. And what we found was that there was sexual abuse of female students happening at one of the schools in Kenya. So this was an investigation that happened over the course of a couple of years, but the first piece took about 8 months to get out for The Intercept. And when that piece dropped, we had all of the right buzzwords in it. So the school was funded by the Gates Foundation, by the Zuckerbergs of Facebook. It also had World Bank funding. So it had all of these links to what we would call like the Western world. And I think because of that, and because of these buzzwords, the story went completely viral. I mean, it was picked up everywhere. Other media outlets covered it. You know, it really got a lot of attention, and that's great. Like that feeling where you've done an investigation, where you focused on equality for women, you focused on trying to right an injustice that was levied against women. That is an amazing feeling. Another example that everyone's probably very familiar with that I did not do is looking into Harvey Weinstein, right? And the movement that created. That was a feminist investigation, and that created an entire movement, right? The Me Too movement. But you know, there are other investigations that don't pop the same way, and I think some of it is luck, some of it is timing, some of it is marketing. But as a reporter in Africa, I have found that having this kind of Western angle does help, and unfortunately, right, we have to sell to a certain extent, and I think that's really important, is trying to figure out what is it that, firstly, your editors, but also potentially your audience is going to want to read about, what is going to make them care about this, and trying to find that connection. And that is an unfortunate part of the jobs that we do, but also I think a critical one in making sure that people actually read the story. And just one other thing that I've found just in my experience is victimhood doesn't really sell very well. I mean, people don't want to hear stories of women and girls, or, you know, people who are kind of portrayed as helpless victims. It's depressing, and people are depressed enough already. And so what I found is a better way to go is accountability journalism. So who are the bad guys? Who is creating the injustice? And how do we right that wrong? What activists are working on this? How are they working on this? Giving people a sense of hope, of inspiration. I think that's often a better route to go than the sad sob story.
Thank you, Neha. Jerry, I think you took part in the investigation that uncovered the $70 million from overseas development aid that went to anti-rights actors in Uganda. Tell us about your role and what you found out and how you went about doing it in the framework of, you know, so many stories that concern the kind of issues that we care about are kind of siloed in certain sections in newspapers, you know, like lifestyle or like women's issues. And these are human issues. These are issues that we all should be concerned about, which is why I think it's important that our definitions of feminism and patriarchy are these all-encompassing, recognizing where the systems of oppression and injustices are. So keeping that in mind, could you tell us about the investigation that you were part of?
Yeah, absolutely. So this investigation was done as a cross-border collaboration. Nana, who briefly touched on it earlier, and IGSC co-director Claire Provo, who talks about this more in the handbook. It was also done with an international aid expert who helped build the portal that we use to extract data from, and a Ugandan activist called Edward Mutebi, who is the founder of an incredible nonprofit called Let's Work Uganda, which advocates for LGBT people's rights in Uganda. And this investigation came out a month before the bill passed. The death penalty is one of the harshest parts of this bill, but it also includes up to a 20-year prison sentence for what it describes as promoting homosexuality, which can include advocating for LGBT rights. And so having him involved in this investigation was essential and crucial to its success. And he was instrumental in helping us understand how we should frame this, how we should promote this and push this out. A key part of the decision to publish was to not partner with just one news group, but to publish this under the IGSC. We partnered with the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. And this meant that we were able to invite many journalists to come from different countries all over the globe, representing the news globally, to brief them, hear from activists themselves who were able to speak for themselves. And this helped hugely with how the impact of this. And what was particularly egregious about the funding itself was that it involved aid donors, governments, international agencies who themselves had spoken out against this bill, who had strict and strong commitments to anti-LGBT rights, and who had said, we're not going to fund these things. And so a key part of my role in this report was to use open source information, local news reports, social media posts, dating back as far as 2009, which is when their first aid project had begun, and to sort of build a timeline that showed these anti-rights activities were happening far before these aid projects and throughout these aid projects, so that we could really take it to donors and say, you said you weren't going to do this, you are doing it. But it also ties in people from across the globe, like your tax money probably went to these groups that have been strongly campaigning for well over a decade to dismantle LGBT rights in Uganda. And we're already seeing the impact of this. People are on death row in Uganda. And yeah, it's a really terrible situation. But as a result of the report, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden all pulled their funding. But I think what it really underpins is that even feminist donors need accountability, it needs scrutiny. And as journalists, we shouldn't just be holding them accountable, we shouldn't just be calling for transparency, but at the heart of what we do, we need to make sure that money that is designated for gender equality actually goes towards pro-rights and women's organizations, because some of this funding, people at the end of the year, these aid donors, they're tallying up their funds and they're saying, we spent this amount on gender equality. How much of that actually went in opposition to it? And that was a really big question that we're continuing to unravel.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm so glad that you mentioned that Norway, Denmark, and Sweden were, after being held accountable, withdrew their funding from these anti-rights groups, because I think that something also as feminists we have to celebrate is our victories, because it can often feel like this is like this thankless task and we never have any victories and we're constantly fighting, which we are, of course. And, especially now with growing fascism around the world, I feel that feminism is uniquely situated and powerfully situated to fight back. And I often say that fascism is to control what feminism is to liberation. And it didn't just start with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump didn't just come out of nowhere overnight. I mean, here in Europe, you saw fascists like Viktor Orban in Hungary, and those in Poland, and Putin in Russia, and others who, years ago began rolling back feminism and the fight against patriarchy by decriminalizing intimate partner violence, by nixing women and gender studies programs at universities. So many things that we're seeing the Trump regime do now are basically like the fascists' anti-feminist handbook. And so I think today we should be especially aware of the importance and the power of feminism to create accountability in the way that the panel has so far discussed. And even in what you might consider kind of like something inconsequential as a television show, such as Adolescence, which I know is a very popular show on Netflix. I'm sure many people in the hall have heard of Adolescence, and it's being celebrated, rightfully so, for pointing out the ways that boys are recruited, and this is a form of recruitment, into misogyny and into sexism and into violence against women, and inceldom and all of that. And so while I celebrate that we're actually seeing now how this is happening, what I'm not celebrating is that so much of the coverage, and this is where I want to come to you now, Nana, so much of the coverage around adolescence is focusing just on boys and just on men, and even like barely anything about the victims of these boys. So we're looking at how boys are recruited into the harm of women, and we're focusing on boys. And so we're sitting there going, oh my God, how can we help boys? Well, excuse me, how can we focus on, the objects of the violence that these boys are being recruited into, carrying out? So how do we make investigations more feminist? How do we impress upon journalists who perhaps don't identify as feminist as we do, the importance, especially today, when we're seeing fascists like Trump and Orban and Putin, and women like Meloni and Marine Le Pen and Alice Weidel in Germany, give this kind of female face to fascism, but we have to remember, they are not feminists just because they're women.
This is such a hard question. I feel like if you're a journalist who's interested in solutions, there's a lot of evidence that shows that the meaningful social change we've had in societies across the globe has been due to the work of feminist movements. So if you're interested in solutions, I think you need to be interested in feminist movements. I think you need to build relationships with activist movements. I think you need to go into spaces where activists are. In the same way where we have a journalism conference where we are all here to learn from one another. You know, feminists and women's rights organizations and queer organizations have their own conveners and are really, really keen to collaborate with journalists, are really keen to work with the kind of journalists who are not interested in having them as victims, right? As just color for their stories. And I feel like that's also part of feminist investigations, being able to put yourself in a position where maybe you're a bit uncomfortable, you're there to listen, you're there to learn, you know, not just because you need a quote or a source, but you're there to really be part of the movement and to learn from the movement. And I think that's how we can create more feminist investigations.
Thank you, Nana. Neha, you know, we've heard from Jerry about how this money going to anti-rights groups was mostly affecting LGBTQ groups. And that is feminist work, to uncover that and to hold accountable people who are harming the LGBTQ community. I'm queer. It's important to me. I'm feminist and queer, you know? We wear many identities and many hats. So how do we ensure that feminist investigative reporting is inclusive of diverse communities and that we impress upon people? As I keep saying, feminism doesn't just equal women, that we fight for so many people. This is why we're so fucking exhausted. We fight for everybody. So how do we ensure that even men, because they too are victims of patriarchy, but we don't just focus on them, you know? So how do we include make sure that we're doing the anti-Trump, which is DEI, you know? How are we diverse, equitable, and inclusive in our feminist reporting?
Yes, I think that's a great question that in huge part has already been answered by Jerry. For example, the work that you did in Uganda, in which you partnered with LGBTQ organizations, you worked directly with people in order to make sure that you framed, investigated, and wrote the investigation the right way. I think that's really critical, that's key. So for me, because I work overseas, I am entirely dependent on the team that I work with, and that means people from the local community, whether that's local journalists who are, you know, giving their time and energy and helping me navigate a story, whether that's community members. I do a lot of work on abortion and reproductive rights. So oftentimes, in order to access women who have had unsafe abortions, which is completely illegal and underground in Kenya, I'll work through NGOs or organizations. Those are always run by women from the community. So it's that kind of the saying that everybody uses, right? Not about us, without us. I am not able to do any of the work that I do unless I partner with people from the local community. They are instrumental in the work. I also think oftentimes in journalism, especially with foreign correspondents, people are referred to as fixers, right? And you know, they're paid for their time, and that's about it. And for me, I think it's critical to give, if they want, to give those folks bylines, to make sure their names are on those stories, and that they not only get compensated fairly for the work they're doing, but also get credit, because they are also building up their own reputations, their own brands. They're doing this work as well, and for you know, a local journalist in Chad to have a byline in the BBC or CNN, that's huge. That can make or break their career. And so I think, you know, making sure that on your team you have people from the community, like what Jerry did with her investigation, and you also are giving those people the appropriate credit, and you're making sure that their voices are elevated in the right way. I think those are all critical steps.
Thank you, Neha. Jerry, you have taken part, or you've contributed to the Feminist Handbook, the Handbook on Feminist Investigative Reporting. Could you share with us some of the case studies and stories that most stuck out for you when you were compiling the chapter that you contributed?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Feminist Investigative Journalism Handbook brings together, I think it's 18 different women from across 5 different continents, all to share lessons from their work on underreported issues that affect women, LGBT people, and indigenous communities. All the women on the stage have contributed in some way, and I see some people in the audience who are also contributors, so nice to see you. And there's some key themes that really stand out to me from this. The first is achieving impact beyond like the initial exposure, and the initial point of publication can take many different forms. My contribution to this handbook was an IGSC investigation that revealed that the ethical marketplace Etsy has shops that are operating from illegal Israeli settlements, including in the West Bank and the Syrian Golan Heights. And Etsy knows about this now and has done nothing about it. But this doesn't end there. Several months after this investigation was published, the IGSC fed into an official UN process, responding to a call for evidence for the 58th Human Rights Council, and we're continuing to try to communicate with the UN to have them added to their official list of companies profiting from trade. And then on the other hand, and especially when it comes to stories of abuse and sexual violence, the point of publication can be a catalyst, and it can create a platform where people can feel empowered to come forward and share their stories, and sometimes revealing new layers to those stories. And there are several chapters in this handbook which go into detail about follow-up reporting that came on the back of new disclosures. And again, throughout this handbook is the importance of amplifying underrepresented voices and communities. And a key lesson is that collaborating with marginalized communities is not only ethically imperative, but as Neha, you've discussed, also enriches the work itself. And as several contributors note throughout this handbook, working closely with members of the communities and we're reporting on, it not only helps us access otherwise hidden narratives, but it informs critical decision-making, creates a deeper, more culturally sensitive investigation. And I would also want to highlight another theme that comes up throughout it, and that's safety and solidarity, which comes up throughout so many of these case studies. Investigative journalism, especially when it comes to sensitive feminist issues, is very challenging. It can be really challenging. And many of these investigations have been conducted by women who are reporting on the impact of gender inequality whilst themselves experiencing gender inequality in all of its different forms. And as women, we're not, a monolithic group. We're defined, and we differ because of race, nationality, sexual identity, and these all impact and intersect with how we experience these different things. And no one is better placed than the people experience it to tell them their own stories. And so ultimately, I think this handbook demonstrates that feminist journalism is not just about unveiling truths, but it's about how we do it through collaboration, community building, and a sense of shared responsibility. And at the IGSC, what really underpins a lot of our work is this notion that ecosystem-wide problems deserve ecosystem-wide responses. Anti-rights actors are very well connected, they're very, very well funded. And by reflecting on and sharing our lessons, successes, but also the challenges and the roadblocks that we face in the way that we're trying to do now, we can continue to push for systemic change and make sure that the voices that are most affected aren't just amplified, but that they're the ones leading the way and they're the ones that are telling their own stories.
Absolutely. I know we've spoken about the Feminist Investigative Journalism Handbook a number of times. It's going to be released in the next couple of weeks. If you go to our website, which is www.theijsc.org, you can sign up so that you get an early copy as soon as we release it.
Thank you, Nana, and thank you, Jerry. I'm going to ask the panel one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, so please think of questions, don't be shy, because if you don't, I will just continue talking. I want to introduce the idea of feminism as a living reality, a lived experience. And when I was writing my first book, Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution, so I was born in Egypt. And after the Egyptian revolution, I wanted to write this book because every revolution has to have feminism at its core. Because if you don't talk about liberation, what kind of revolution are you talking about? And I would often hear from men, but Mona, this isn't the time for feminism. We have to release the political prisoners. We have to work on the education system. And they would give me a whole list of things, as if feminism and the liberation that I'm talking about is this tiny niche thing which only impacts 51% of society. And we're supposed to wait, until the men have taken care of all the things that matter to them, and then it's our turn to be liberated. And they would say to me, but none of us is free. Or none of us are free. And I would say to them, that is true, because the state oppresses everyone, men and women. But here's the difference. The state and the street and the home, what I call the trifecta of patriarchy, so imagine a triangle, state, street, and home, together oppress women and those of us who are not cisgender heterosexual men. And so what men focus on is the way that the state oppresses them. But they don't want to acknowledge the way that they are complicit with the state in the ways that they treat us in the street, and that includes the workplace, and in the home. And I tell them that unless we topple the tyrant, not just in the state, but in the street and in the home, none of us will be free. And the hardest revolution of all is the revolution in the home, because all tyrants go home. So keeping in mind this trifecta of patriarchy, how would you, in your work with feminist investigative reporting, how would you explain to people how feminism is this daily thing? I often tell people, feminism isn't a coat that I wear when a man has been a shit to me. Feminism is 24 hours, 7 days a week, every year, So how would you impress upon people the lived experience of feminism?
I think for me, it's very much in showcasing the lived experiences of women. And I do this in my personal life, which is also my professional life. I'm a writer, and I like to write about deeply personal subjects. I like to write about the body. I like to write about women's experiences of relationships with whoever they're in relationship with. I'm also the author of a book called The Sex Lives of African Women. And for me, choosing to write about sex was a very political act. There's that old feminist adage, the personal is political. And I did my book by interviewing women across the African continent and the diaspora and retelling those stories in the first person so people could hear from those women directly, and that's a part of almost like a feminist qualitative research project, right? Because we often do not see women's lives and women's experiences as valid sources of information. And I think for me, that's like a part of my feminist politics, to treat women's experiences as a source and a valid source of research and information, which I think should inform policy, which I think should result in change in the wider world. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh, and just to say, my book is actually just been translated into Italian. Yes, and it's available at the bookshop.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. Nana's book is wonderful. I happily blurbed it. Please do get it. It's at the bookshop.
And so is Mona's book.
My second book, The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls, which has truly fucked the patriarchy. Neha.
Yes, so two things came up when you were asking this question. The first is just my own personal experience coming into my own version of feminism. I was raised in the United States in the 1990s, early 2000s. I was told from, the word go that I could do anything that I ever wanted to do. And for a very long time, I did not think that I experienced discrimination or that I lived in a patriarchal structure because it didn't feel like I did. And I would say that, and this may be the same for a lot of people in the room who might be in my age bracket, but that fundamentally changed for me personally with the 2016 American election, in which I felt personally devastated to see somebody who was openly a sex offender who talked about grabbing women by the pussy, defeating whatever you feel about her personally, a very well-qualified female candidate for president. And that was actually the catalyst for me starting to focus on women in my work. So that's kind of my personal journey to feminist investigative reporting. But one thing that you had mentioned, Mona, is I do a lot of conflict and post-conflict work. So I've worked in Yemen, in Somalia, Mozambique, a number of countries that have experienced either civil war or are experiencing ongoing insurgency. And one of the things that I've found is this delay of including women in any kind of peace process. And I think there are a number of different movements, international movements, to include women in peace processes. So whether we were looking at Afghanistan, which now obviously is no longer even a viable option, but in Yemen, I know this was a big topic of conversation, that the people going into the room to discuss peace, whether it was Iranians or Saudis or Emiratis, they were men. And women had no voice. And yet, when we actually look at the data and the information out there, it is women and their local efforts for peace that are the most effective. When women come together, women from communities, and they talk about peace, they are the ones who are able to achieve that peace better than any men sitting in any room in a Middle Eastern capital is able to do. And so I think it's really critical when we talk about having women involved in breaking down this trifecta of patriarchy, that this isn't just something that is as a good idea, you know, in theory, and that we think, oh, this is what's equitable and right. This is the way that peace is made. This is the way that these things are achieved, through the work of women who are the heads of their families, even if they might not be, you know, treated as such, who are the glue that hold families and communities together. So I think that's just really critical to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think a few things come to mind here. I think oftentimes, you know, feminist issues and issues affecting LGBT people, these are conversations that are happening in people's homes. They happen behind closed doors. And to people who aren't privy to those conversations, if it seems like a fringe issue, investigative journalism and feminist journalism is about bringing these conversations into the forefront and bringing them out into, and opening up conversations. Nana's book, which I'm going to mention again, Sex Lives of African Women, opens a door into a world that many, you know, we don't often get to hear about and don't often get to see, and that's very important. But I also think when we talk about, you know, we talked about adolescence earlier and this concept of toxic masculinity. And I think this often gets misconstrued as meaning toxic men. But masculinity is a construct. It's one that impacts men just as much as it impacts women. And we're seeing about the men's mental health crisis going up. These are not separate issues. And by dismantling the patriarchy, by calling out these toxic things that are happening, this also lifts up men. And in our work in International Aid for Palestine, you know, that work didn't just focus on women and children. It included the men of Palestine. And I think some people often speak about conflict zones, and they talk about women and children who have been targeted. But as feminists, our principles when it comes to apartheid, when it comes to ethnic cleansing and genocide, we should care about it regardless of who is being targeted. And I think as feminists, we of course are uplifting ourselves and uplifting the women and the LGBT people in our lives and amplifying their voices, but there is a lot of work and good stuff that feminism is doing for men. And I don't think it gets acknowledged enough, and I think that people often, like, men sometimes may find it alienating, but there is a space for you at this table, and I just want to say thank you to all the men that have come. When we walked in, we said we wanted to individually thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for bringing that up, because I think it's really important. When I was talking about feminism being about destroying the patriarchy, it's also about liberating us from the patriarchy. And feminism liberates men too from the patriarchy. It liberates all of us. And I often tell people, my feminism is about liberation much more than equality, because I don't want to be equal to a man who himself is not free. I think if men were really honest with themselves, it's only a really small group of men who are truly free. And that is cisgender, heterosexual, wealthy, able-bodied, and conservative mostly. But if you're not all of those things, you are not a free man. And I don't want to be equal to someone who's not free. I want to be free. So on that note, and so because I don't want to talk for the rest of the 20 minutes we have left, or 15 minutes, I would love to hear from you all. So who has a question? Look at that, oh my goodness. Fabulous.
Hi, thank you so much. You're all legends, and I'm really happy to be here this morning. My name is Becky Shuka, and I work for the Public Interest News Foundation. I wanted to thank you for uplifting the work of local journalists around the world in your answers. My organisation uses advocacy and research to fight for local journalists in the UK. So I was wondering, from your experience working with local journalists, whether there are any recommendations you have for journalism support organisations and how we can support local feminist journalists who are doing this work. Thanks.
Thank you. I think we'll take 2 more questions and tell us who you want to answer your question, and then whoever in the panel wants to answer them, if you don't have a name, will. So 2 more questions, and then we will remember your question about local journalists. I have not forgotten.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for a brilliant panel and the discussion. My name is Deepa Paron. I am an independent journalist, but I cover human rights abuses, especially crimes committed against women in Iran during the Women Life Freedom protest for The Guardian, for the Guardian's Rights and Freedom Project. So during the Women Life Freedom movement, when it started in 2022 after Mahsa Amini's death, we covered this story where security forces were shooting at the breasts and genitals of female protesters. However, when they were shooting at the men, they were shooting at their head or backs or legs. Now, that story went on the front page, and of course, it was one of the highlights of my career, but I really got upset because after that, we covered so many brilliant stories, but Neha was mentioning how buzzwords kind of make an impact. How do we make people care about other investigations when it comes to crimes against women? So that's my question.
Thank you. One more question, and then the panel will answer.
Hello. Hi, here. I'm Camila, I'm from Ecuador. Now I'm living in Poland. And my question was around, because now I'm studying women's gender studies in Poland. And when I came to Europe, I just didn't face the patriarchy, but also the white feminists. And I want to ask you, how to deal with this, for most of the people who is living in the diaspora, how to face with white feminists, because this really gets me more into the colonial studies. So where is the midpoint there? And second, you were saying being feminist is 24 hours, 7 days. How you deal with the burnout? Because it happened to me that sometimes I just cannot open the computer because it's just so much violence, not just in the world, but also outside. So how to go outside this burnout? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, panel, have at it.
All right. So many great questions. I think I'll just start with the last one first. In terms of how to deal with burnout, I think it's really being strict about when you're working and when you're off. I find, funny enough, just having barriers on my phone to stop me from being on social media really helps. There's a way in which I love Instagram, but all of the scrolling makes me really, really tired. And I think it's also about having feminist community, people that you don't have to defend yourself to, you don't have to explain yourself to, you can just be. That's my recommendation.
Yeah, and I can speak to the question about impact. So I think this is a work in progress. I'm still struggling with this myself in my work. There are certain investigations that I've done where I'm like, oh gosh, this is great. I mean, this is great work, and we put time and effort, and editors have gone through it, and we've spent ages doing the reporting, and then it comes out, and it's just like, Prince Harry did something or Trump said something, and it's like nobody reads it, or it feels like nobody reads it. And I've talked to people about this, and one of the things that I think we need to remember with journalism is journalism is creating the first draft of history, right? We are creating a legacy that people will be able to look at. There used to be this museum in Washington, D.C. called the Newseum. It's closed down now, but they had the front page of every New York Times since like 18-something. And these are documents that are going to create a trail, a paper trail of history. And people will go back and they will look at this and they will rely on this, and this is a way for us to see the evolution of certain issues throughout human history. And so I think in the moment, sometimes, especially with social media, with views, clicks, hits, whatever, is trending, it's easy, I think, to get caught up in this feeling of oh God, no one read it, it didn't go viral on Twitter or X. But I do think that, it's really important to remember that now when people look this up, You know, the next time that there is an uprising, the next time that there is a revolution, or when, you know, maybe women in Iran are going to find a way to get access to this, they will see the work that you have done, and that will be there. And I think that's really important to remember.
Jerry, would you like to do the local journalist question?
I don't know if I can.
No? Okay. Any of the other questions you'd like to handle?
Yeah, I wanted to mention your question about burnout. I think, you know, what you said about community building was really important, but when I was like at the beginning of my career, when I was covering disinformation, I was looking at things in Ukraine that were really difficult and quite harrowing to see. And then when things started to unfold in Gaza, I noticed that the situation that I was in as a journalist, seeing quite horrific things that bled over into my daily life, now everyday citizens are just seeing on a daily basis and having to deal with. And so even non-journalists are now having to take responsibility for their online spaces, and I would say that that is really, really important for everyone on social media to be cautious about how you're consuming, and at night, like, you don't want to be saying that before you go to bed. It can really have a big impact on you. But you mentioned about doom and gloom, and I just want to come back to what we talked about earlier about having some optimism about this, because we did this investigation to Uganda in 2023, and donors did pull their funding, and we're now continuing to try and engage with donors in a proactive way to dismantle this funding, to move this funding over. And especially when you're at the beginning of your career, maybe you don't know as many people, reach out to other people in your class, build communities within your class. The more that you have connections and you start building a bigger community of feminist journalists around you, I think that sense of optimism and that sense of having a purpose to work towards will give you a better sense of less doom and gloom, and I think more optimism in this space, because when you look on the news, it can feel very daunting, but I think when you reach out to communities around you and you hear the work of other women in this kind of forum and across this festival, it can give you a better sense of optimism. I think that's important that we should take away. We should be optimistic about the work that we're doing.
Yeah. Neha, you mentioned fixes earlier, so perhaps you could touch on the local journalist issue.
Yeah, happy to. I think, you know, with local journalism is the most important kind of journalism. I was attending a panel yesterday in which there was a woman who created an organization that has 4 journalists who are covering Appalachia in the United States. And I mean, that was like, and there are stories that are just never going to make it into the New York Times or CNN or, you know, insert major publication here, that are the exact kinds of stories that are going to create change on the ground in communities, right? That's how journalism started. And obviously with all of the funding and business issues that we have, we've moved away from that. But I think it's really critically important that we support the work of hyper-local journalists who are reporting in their communities. I'm not sure that this is necessarily the answer, but one idea that I have is, if you are trying to push more feminist investigations in your local reporting, the same way that I was saying with, you know, African reporting, that I need to find some kind of Western angle to make people happy and to kind of sell the story, I would recommend doing something similar with your work if you're able to do that. So what are, you know, if you're reporting in a small city in the UK, right? Like, what are the issues? Maybe it's a port city, or maybe it's an industrial city, and there are certain economic or political issues that are really specific to that demographic that you know that your neighbors on either side of you are really going to care about. Is there a way to connect your feminist investigation to that? Maybe it's labor practices that are affecting women in the local factory, or, you know, whatever it is, you know. But I think trying to find that connection that's going to speak to the people who are reading your paper, to the editor who's sitting in town, you know, commissioning stories, I think that's going to probably be the way to get it in there. And it's unfortunate that we can't just say this matters because it matters, but if you're going to be strategic, that might be a way to do it.
Thank you, Neha. So we have to wrap up, but we are going to be around. So for those who have more questions, do come, you know, don't be shy, come and talk to us. And I would like you all to remember to sign up for the Feminist Journalist Handbook, and buy Nana's book from the bookshop and mine. And also sign up for my newsletter, Feminist Giant, because I didn't answer your question about how do you combat burnout. But one of the things I do in Feminist Giant is twice a week, I curate stories of feminist resistance from around the world. And they're not stories of how many women were raped or how many queer people were subjected to homophobic attacks. These are stories about feminist resistance, whether it's indigenous women, whether it's trans women, whether it's women in different parts of the world. And these actually happen. And when I curate these stories, people often write to me and say, I had no idea this was happening. Where did you find this? And I would say to them, it's out there, but because of the way we're trained to talk about news, by men, for men, and about men, we don't see it. So seek out stories of feminist resistance and celebrate them as victories. And as this victory, I would like you all to please give a big round of applause for our panel. And I'm going to do something that I do at the end of all of my talks. For those of you who can stand up, please stand up, and after the count of 3, we're going to chant, "Fuck the patriarchy." Stand up. You might want to film this, because people like to take this at home, because it's a good thing to go out there, okay? At the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Fuck the patriarchy! Thank you all very much.